Welcome to this 4-week class on Chinese religion. So we're going to be looking and evaluating some of the major religious views that emerged in China over a period of approximately 3,500 years. So we'll start tonight with folk religion and Confucianism, then we're going to move to Taoism, then to Buddhism, and finish up with Christianity. So here we must realize that Chinese history is composed of numerous dynasties, as depicted in the following chart. You can see the last one ends at the beginning of the 20th century. That's when we get the Republic and then the Civil War and the rise of Communist China. But over that, all those other periods of time, these were dynastic monarchies. They were emperors. And you can see some of them lasted a fairly long time. So the problem is when you try and articulate anything about Chinese religion over such a long period of time, you're going to have to make some generalizations and perhaps simplifications. But nevertheless, we'll do our best. I'm going to outline some of the essential elements of those major religious traditions that I mentioned. And so we'll start with what we call Chinese folk religion. So what do we mean by folk religion? In general, it refers to those religious beliefs and practices found at the popular level of culture, as opposed to the more literary and elitist forms of spirituality. If you look at any civilization, you'll have your literary elite. These are the people who can read, write, and know the texts. They're usually a minority in terms of the population. Below that is the large majority. Folk religion tends to take place amongst the lower element. Now, they're not completely separate. They do merge. But even if you look at, for example, medieval Europe, when you had the church and all the advancements of the high officials and priests, etc., below that you had a majority of people who carried on many local traditions. That's why if you go to Italy today, you can see little shrines here and there. And so this is always part of every major religious tradition. Anthropologists usually refer to them as the great tradition, which is the literary tradition, and the small tradition, which is the folk religion. But they do flow together, and since we're speaking of China, they sort of flow together like the yin and the yang. Okay, they come in and out and they overlap. And especially in a country as large as China, there's not just one folk religion. There are, generally the folk religion is regional. It will apply to regional customs, regional deities, etc., tied in with the larger. So it's impossible to say what folk religion is, again, but that will stop us from trying to say a few words about it. So in general, Chinese folk religion, which is called Shenism, can we see that on there? Does it say Shenism, I think? Okay. Mm-hmm. It includes certain aspects of traditional belief systems such as, and these are, I'm just picking the 3 most important aspects of folk religion. Animism. It's the worldview that natural physical entities, animals, plants, even inanimate objects or phenomena, have a spiritual essence to them. So there's nothing that's dead. Everything is sort of alive. It's animistic. Secondly, shamanism, which is the practice that involves a trained practitioner of making contact with the spirits. And that's often done through systems of trance, sometimes drugs. But this is an individual who is trained to make connection with the spirits. And then finally, and this is probably the most universal of all of them in folk religion, is ancestor worship. Ancestor worship. Veneration and communication with the dead and rituals related to that. So those are the 3 main elements that make up folk religion. The rituals, myths, festivals, other practices are all an important part of this, and then you channel these into certain worldviews, which tend to be sometimes local combined with universal. So we have a number of gods that are related to folk religion. They're often related to nature, as you can imagine, because of animism, to clan deities because of ancestor worship. Each clan has a deity, and to cultural heroes. Anthropologists have counted over 300 such deities, and that's probably underestimated throughout China. And I'm just going to talk about 5 or 6 briefly so you get an idea. Remember, these are the gods that lie underneath the main tradition. The main tradition doesn't necessarily deal with these gods, but most people do, because folk religion is very strong. So we have a deity by the name of Shangdi. He's synonymous with the concept of heaven. Now, I say that because in the main tradition, which is Confucianism, which we'll get to in the next part of this class, there's something called the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is that which heaven wants. And in terms of political setup, the emperor has to have the mandate of heaven to be legitimized. If he doesn't have the mandate of heaven, his rule is not legitimized. But this Shangdi, on the popular level, is often related to heaven. Then there's this ugly fellow, Pangu, creator god. Number of myths about Pangu. He's depicted as primitive, hairy, sometimes with horns on his head and clad in furs. He set about the task of creation of the world, and he separated it from the original yin-yang connection. Originally, there was a yin-yang connection, and then he, in folk religion, drew from that and created the world. What's interesting is he creates, as in most creation myths, he creates all the various creatures and animals and plants. And last, he creates man, which he compares to lice. Lice on the body of the earth. It might not be too far off. Okay. Then we have the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, regarded as the founder of China. So this is a god who founded China. Pangu creates the earth. Huangdi creates China. So now, this is a very important deity. This is the deity of your nation, of your people. So he's very, at the local level, very strongly. And then there's this interesting group. They're called the Baxian, or the 8 Immortals. These are hero deities. They're often related to some great military adventure or some great artistic accomplishment, but then they're deified. What happens when something is deified? What can you do to it when it's deified? You worship it. You can worship it. So these 8 immortals are worshipped at various levels throughout the country. Yeah, the little symbols of these, exactly. Then we have Shi Wang Mu, Queen Mother of the West, a mother goddess. In folk religions, you're always going to find the feminine principle represented. She is the mother goddess of the West, who reigns over a mountain of paradise and has the power to make others immortal. So that's a pretty good power. I mean, you might want to offer a few prayers to her. In some myths, she is the mother of the Jade Emperor, who's one of the 3 primordial emanations of the Tao. I don't want to get into all the levels we'll do that when we get to Taoism. But out of the Tao comes the yin-yang, out of the yin-yang comes the world, out of all these various steps. And along the line, we have the Jade Emperor. So these are just some examples of folk deities, and they are popularly worshipped throughout China, even today. Even with the communist state being what it was, it's very hard to completely repress religion. You can drive it underground for a while. And that's generally because religion, whether it's true or false, I'm not going to argue that, answers questions that purely secular ideologies cannot, usually related to death. And whether we like to think, believe it, not believe it, a lot of people are concerned with death. What happens? Okay. In any case, so those are some of the popular deities. Okay, here's an example of a Shenist temple. You'll find them throughout China. They're decorated with traditional figures on the outside. And then on the inside, you have the various deities. And just like many other religions, you have an altar, you have ways of making offerings to these gods in hope that they will hear you and in some way respond, if not immediately, eventually. So one of the most prominent folk religion ceremonies, and this is very prominent, is related to the ancestors. Depending on the region, a person who has recently departed is believed to return home between 7 and 49 days after death. So they return home as a spirit, 7 or 49 days after death. When the spirit returns, it is invited to inhabit the ancestral tablet. Every family will have one of these tablets, which lists the ancestors. And they're in the home. So you always have the ancestors with you in some sense. So there are rituals 7 to 49 days after the death where that spirit is listed at the bottom of the ancestral tablet, the latest ancestor to depart. And that name will remain there, and then somewhat as sort of semi-permanent till about 30 years later, then it's made permanent. Yeah. And the spirits are honored with food and incense at the ancestral altar. So there'll be a tablet, and every family will generally have a little altar. Chris and I were impressed by this in China. So when we got home, we made an ancestor altar in one of our closets. So we have a little altar with a variety of deities on it, and then it's pictures of family members as far back as we've been able to collect. And periodically, just especially on birthdays, we just sort of open it up. And remember, see, the important thing about ancestor worship is that there's this understanding that just because someone dies doesn't mean you're not connected with them. We are connected with the dead more than we realize through memory, through all sorts of things. And the more you keep that alive, the more it will be part of your psyche. We don't even keep it. What do we do these days? We go out to some cemetery 5 miles out of town, and then maybe once a year go out. Okay, this is the idea that the dead and the living are not that far apart. There are different levels of existence. The dead are there, and as we'll see in some of the festivals. Okay. Chinese folk religion is also known for its numerous festivals, and I'm only going to mention 2. One is called the Hungry Ghost Festival, which is related to the return of the dead, and the second is called the Dragon Boat Festival. So what is the Hungry Ghost Festival? It's celebrated during the 7th month of the Chinese calendar during the night of the full moon. During this month, the gates of hell are opened up, and the ghosts are free to roam the earth where they seek food and entertainment. Why are they in hell, or why are they ghosts? It's believed those who forgot to pay tribute to the ancestors after they died, or those who were never given a proper ritual send-off. Yet many ancient cultures, it's very important to give the dead a proper send-off. If it isn't done, they roam as ghosts. They're not put into solid places. So you find this in Chinese folk religion. So on this day, family members dress up as ghosts. What's one way to defend yourself against something? Become it. Ghosts expel other ghosts. But you offer prayers, food, drink to the deceased ancestors. And sometimes you burn various forms of paper. There's something called hell banknotes. They're sort of, what would you, sort of cryptocurrency for hell. Because these, that you somehow, you're warding the ghosts off through buying them banknotes. Where do these traditions come from? Who knows? Anthropologists spend years trying to figure out why this is done at this tree and not a, but we know it exists because it's practiced. It also helps ward off bad luck. So that's one of the main festivals found throughout China in different forms. The other one, this is a very interesting one. It's called the Dragon Boat Festival. It occurs on the 5th day of the 5th month of the traditional Chinese calendar, generally in June, so it's coming up. Focuses on celebrations, involves eating what are called sticky rice dumplings, drinking wine, and racing dragon boats. Hopefully not drinking too much wine before racing the boats. It's believed to have originated in ancient China. One popular legend claimed its origins to have been connected to the suicide in 278 BCE of one Ku Yuan. You see his statue to the left there. He was a prominent poet and statesman in the kingdom of Chu. So how did the Dragon Boat Festival get associated with this gentleman's suicide? It's said that the local people who admired him raced out in their boats to save him. He drowned himself, or at least retrieve his body. When they couldn't find the body, they dropped balls of sticky rice into the river so that the fish would eat the sticky rice and not his body. Now that's an interesting development as to tracing the origins of some sort of festival. So this is what is done yearly. It's sort of a celebration, some drinking and eating and boat racing, and then dropping these sticky rice cakes into the water. What's that? Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, they do it in Taiwan. Yeah, yeah, yeah. These folk religions are found. Again, they're variations, but they're found throughout China. Um, okay, so that's just a little bit about folk religion. I always want to emphasize that because when we study religion here in the West, we generally look at the big traditions. You take a religion course, you're going to read scripture, you're going to read the doctrines, you're going to read the official view of the official liturgy. You usually don't learn what's going on in the villages or what's at the popular level. So it's always important to remember that. Most people who practice religion practice forms of folk religion. There might be a dominant cultural tradition above it, which filters down, of course, but this other aspect is very prominent. Okay, so now I want to turn to Confucianism. Who was Confucius? 551 to 479 BCE. Did people get outlines? Okay. He was an ancient Chinese thinker. His philosophy emphasized personal and governmental morality. So he was both interested in personal morality, but also government morality. Also, the correctness of social relationships, justice, and sincerity. These were the main ideas that he was concerned with. Now, he lived in a time called the Warring States period, when culture had virtually fallen apart. There were political rivalries. So he was looking at a time of cultural disaster and trying to answer the question, how do we fix this? So what we need today is another Confucius. Okay, how do we fix this disaster? Um, so after the Qin dynasty collapsed, the Han dynasty came into being in 202 BCE. This is important because, see, Confucius lived in 551 BCE. His teachings didn't become official until 202. So it took like 300 years for his teachings to become recognized as official teachings of the state, of the Han dynasty. Um, Now, much of Confucianism is based on a series of texts called the Five Classics, in which he's thought to have been the author. Probably not. Sort of like Moses is considered the author of the Torah. Probably not. Or even Homer, the author of the Iliad. Probably not. Probably a collection of people, then one name is assigned to it. But in any case, like I've said many times, if you're studying a culture, it's just important to know what people believe as to know what's actually true, because they act on what they believe. So in any case, so what are the five classics? The first one is called the I Ching. Has anyone ever heard of the I Ching? It's sometimes called the Book of Changes, generally held to be the earliest. It's a book of divination, meaning prophetic insights, based on synchronistic interaction between yin and yang. If, if you get a copy of the I Ching, you'll find a bunch of hexagrams, and you roll dice or pick or drop sticks, which then give you all the various combinations of yin yang. You ask a question, and then you read the answer. And the answers are very cryptic often. They don't tell you exactly. They sort of they're meant to open up your creative mind to possibilities. It'll never tell you yes or no or something like that. In any case, the I Ching. It was made famous by Carl Jung, who translated it. You can go out and buy a copy. It's kind of fun to play with sometimes. The second text is called the Book of Poetry, classic of poetry, which is really songs. It's the earliest anthology of Chinese poems and songs. It extols poetry and music as basic conveyors of human feeling. It was often said by Confucius that every gentleman should either be a poet or appreciate poetry. So it's this you don't have to basically be a great poet, but you should appreciate poetry, appreciate good music, because it does something to your emotional connection in terms of social relationships. The third is the Book of Documents or Book of History, a compilation of various figures, their speeches, etc., records of events in time, very much like some of the ancient Greek texts. And this is the idea that you can learn from history. So a lot of this, the part of that text has things that what was going wrong? What were things that people did wrong? What were things that people did right? We have to know our history. If you don't have your history, you lose your roots, you lose your connections, you lose any idea of what's right or wrong, you lose any idea of what's truth, what's facts, you just all goes. Fourth was the Book of Rites. It describes ceremonial rites, which reflect community continuity. Okay? This is ritual. Communal ritual. What does communal ritual do? It brings the community together. Okay? You see this in all religions, right? Rituals are not individual acts. You can have individual, but basically the power of ritual is its communal aspect. And so this is a book with all various communal rituals that give cohesion to a society. Confucius was very concerned with societal cohesion. Once you lose societal cohesion, the center will not hold. Things fall apart. And the centrifugal force just keeps taking them further and further out. And then 5 was something called the Spring and Autumn Annals. Again, these are historical chronicles, which are designed to give collective memory to a group of people. People need collective memory. That's what history is, collective memory. We tend to not think of it that way. We tend to think, oh, I'll read history. But it's meant to be a group thing. Whenever you think of Confucius, think of the social aspect. That was his concern. Individuals by themselves, well, chaos. It's in the Spring and Autumn Annals. This also gives you some idea of Confucius's idea of his nature of thinking. His claim that the best path to attain political change was through reanimating the old rather than abolishing it. You see the difference? Take what's there as your core, reconstruct it, reanimate it. Because if you completely destroy it, what are you left with? A void. You have nothing really to build upon. So political change had to be a reanimation of the past, not a revolution. So Confucius is anti-revolutionary in that sense. Okay? He's for reconstruction rather than revolution. And I would think if you look at the history of revolutions, you can see there's some wisdom there. Nearly every major revolution, perhaps except for the American Revolution, it had some of it, end up with extreme violence, what they call reigns of terror. So revolution often speaks to us because of the problems of the time, but Confucius said, be wary. Try and take what's good from the past and rebuild on it. So Confucius' teaching is generally seen as a form of humanism, or what the philosopher Herbert Fingaret calls the secular as sacred. Consider the secular as sacred. That's because Confucius doesn't spend a lot of time talking about gods, or talking about the soul, or talking about the afterlife. He does believe in something called heaven, which is sort of a spiritual realm, and he believes in the mandate of heaven, that we have to be connected with heaven through proper ideas, sort of like Plato in that sense. The ideas of justice, those are eternal ideas. But he's really concerned with how human beings live and act. And therefore, a lot of it is really based on what we would call ethics. That doesn't mean he didn't have a spiritual aspect, but it's just not emphasized. I think it is often said, if you want to know what heaven's like, wait till you get there. You know what it's like here, and you can do something about it. So, in any case. So Confucius was primarily concerned, like I said, with human betterment, which rests on the belief, and this is crucial, that human beings are teachable, improvable, perfectible through personal, communal self-cultivation and education. Very important aspect is education. How a culture takes what is there in its good seed and promotes it. That's the role of society and education. Many of the early Enlightenment thinkers were interested in this idea when new ideas of education were coming out. This is where we call environmental factors. You know, nature, nurture, right? There is nature, which Confucius says is essentially good. But if there isn't nurture, there isn't proper nurture through education, through social relationships, that good nurture, that good nature will not develop, will not flower. So he thought the focus was on ethics, which in turn are characterized by what he called the 5 constants. And I'm only going to look at 3, and these are the 3 most important. Well, the first they are, and then I'll get to this one. Ren, R-E-N, which means humaneness. 2, Yi, righteousness or justice. And 3, li, propriety or good manners. So let's look at each one of these a little closer. This is the ideogram for Ren. You know, Chinese isn't written with letters. It's written in what's called ideograms. What's interesting, it's made up of 2 components. On the left is the symbol for man, and on the right is the symbol for 2. So man plus 2. What does that mean? Connection. And this is Ren. Ren. It's thus the essence of being human. If you just have the one on the left, that's not the essence of being human. The essence of being human is connection with other humans. In its most dramatically seen, says Confucius, almost it's intrinsic when you see it, a dependent infant by caring parents. This is the ideal of Ren, the parent-child connection. This is the old form, yeah. Yes. I don't know. Yeah. So the way through of humanness is through human interaction, which begins with the family. That's where it begins. Human interaction begins with the family and then expands outward. Thus, Confucius will place much emphasis on the family. Without solid family structure, you won't get anything above it, because that's the core. You won't get solid political structure if you don't have solid family structure, according to Confucius. The combination of human interaction and love is expressed as follows. Fan Qi asked about humaneness. This comes from a source called the Analects of Confucius, and it's usually in the form of a question to Confucius and an answer. So Fan Qi asks about humaneness. The master said, it is loving people. Fan Qi asked about wisdom. The master said, it is knowing people. In other words, love and knowledge of others is what it means to be a human. If you don't have love and knowledge of others, you're not human. In fact, he would sometimes said, a person cannot be called human, but rather an animal, if you don't have those. But when a human is able to be humane, she or he will then also know themselves. You only know yourself, not in isolation, through interaction with others. That's an important idea, I think. We come to know who we are by how we interact with other people. A person who lives in complete isolation won't have that. So therefore, you don't find in the Confucian tradition asceticism. You don't find monks or guys going out to caves and living by themselves, because that's seen as antisocial. In fact, when we get to Buddhism, that was one of the criticisms, although Buddhism did flourish in China, one of the earliest criticisms from Confucian scholars was that it was taking away, because it was sending monks out to monasteries rather than keeping them in the family. But we'll get to that later. But again, this is interesting. When Buddhism was introduced into China, Buddha's name was translated in the one who is able to be human. That's interesting. The one who is able to be human. So Ren further consists of 5 basic virtues: seriousness, generosity, kindness, sincerity, and diligence. Those if you break them down. But they're all designed to create this, what he calls humaneness, bringing people together. Yi, righteousness or justice, is based upon the idea of reciprocity. It may simply mean what is ethically best to do in any given context. The term contrasts with action done completely out of self-interest. So yi is action which is not done completely out of self-interest, but in the interest of justice. It is based on the following a path designed to enhance the greater good. The greater good. One of the most famous teachings of Confucius in this regard was a variant on what we call the Golden Rule. But it was stated in negative form. It was stated as follows: what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. That's the basic rule of yi. It's the basic rule of justice. Quite simple when stated, not so easy to do. This is one of my favorites, li. It's often translated as ritual, but I like it when it's translated as etiquette. In fact, I bet if you went out and asked a lot of young people what the word etiquette meant, they probably wouldn't know what it, and they probably never heard it. Okay? A type of good manners. And it's understood as a mode of proper action that denotes a person of culture. How a person acts with other people. Just little things that that person does. And it is said that this has to be taught. It isn't automatic. We have to be taught this. We have to be taught what are good manners. We have to be taught proper etiquette. And that's done by fathers, village elders, and at the top, government officials. We have to have a proper sense of etiquette and decorum. How you just treat another person. Piety, good faith, loyalty. A civilized person would use li to act with propriety in every social context. Confucius regarded the disorder of his era, remember he lived during a time of breakdown, as society's neglect of li. People just didn't treat each other with li. They had, and you know, I think even Winston Churchill said the beginning of the decline of any civilization is the loss of good manners. In the Analects, he states, unless a man has the spirit of the rights and knows how to be respectful, he will soon become unruly and fall to the level of the beast. So Ren, Yi, and Li embedded in what are called the 5 basic relationships. 1, father to son. 2, ruler to subject. 3, to younger brother. 4, husband to wife. And to friend. Now you'll notice that these are hierarchical. There is superiority, and there is, I'm not going to say inferiority, but there's the higher and the lower. But what's important here, as far as Confucius is concerned, is the role and not the person. You see the difference? The role of father and the role of son, as opposed to 2 separate individuals. because those roles require certain types of behavior. So all except the last, friend to friend, involves the authority of one person over another. But it's authority based on the principles that we've just seen, not on the idea of an individual controlling another. You see the difference between those two? You can have a father who says, you need to obey me, not because I am Bill Garlington, but because I am father, and I represent these principles to you as son. And one day, you will be father. You see the difference between the two? It's not the idea that you're my son and you just do as I say, not what I do. I mean, do as I do, whatever it is. So sometimes when people see Confucius, they say it's hierarchical. And it is to some degree. Because Confucius believed without some notion of superiority, and I don't like to say inferiority because it doesn't mean you're inferior, without that basic connection, then order falls apart. The difference being it's on the role, not the person. The role, not the person. So like it says, the superior owes loving responsibility to those beneath him through Ren, Li, Yi, and Li. If you lose that, then you'll get hierarchical control, and that's not a good thing. He argued that the best government is one that is ruled through Li, Ren and Yi, and people's natural morality rather than using bribery or coercion. Confucius believed people were basically good, basically moral. If taught by those who are acting out what is good and moral, they will grow and develop, and society will flow. It's when you lose those elements that it'll start to fall apart. So in a time of division, chaos, and endless wars between feudal states, he wanted to restore the mandate of heaven. And essentially the mandate of heaven are those principles. Living by those principles at all levels of society. Rulers would succeed to power on the basis of their moral merits. Should I say that again? On their moral merits instead of lineage or wealth. In this regard, Confucius believed that if a ruler were to lead correctly, his people would follow. And if a ruler leads incorrectly, his people will likely follow. Since actions speak louder than words. A very important aspect of Confucian belief. If your father's just saying things and not doing them, that's not right. And that's when we come to this interesting idea, what he called the rectification of names. In this regard, he believed that social disorder often stemmed from failure to perceive, understand, and deal with reality. Fundamentally, then, social disorder can stem from the failure to call things by their proper names. The rectification of names means that things in actual fact should be made to accord with the names we give them. Don't call a person a father, a ruler, or anything else unless he or she acts like a father. Da-da-da, da-da-da. You see the difference there? If we call something something, and it isn't really what it should be, then we're out of kilter. We have to rectify our names. Call things as they are. And if people are not acting as a father should act, or as a president should act, or as whatever should act, don't call them that. Because by calling them that, you actually give them the power of that name. Names are powerful things. We often use your name. Name what we call something. That means we're giving some sort of justification to it. So he had this whole idea. Go through and rectify the rectification of names. Now, much of his teaching can be summarized by his ideal man. Now, remember, this is a patriarchal society, but the ideal there was called the Junzi. This is the ideal type of being in Confucius's world. He does more and speaks less. He is loyal and knowledgeable, so he's educated. He disciplines himself. He doesn't need someone to discipline him. Once he's learned the various values, he then disciplines himself. He doesn't need to be controlled from the outside. He is a clear mind and filled with learning. This is the Confucian emphasis on education, learning, that was a dominant theme of Confucian China. You had a scholarly class, actually, who were the rulers. There was the emperor as the symbol, but the Confucian scholars were the ones who controlled most of society. He is not to be confused with the type of individual that is beclouded. What does beclouded mean? It's sort of like the cataracts in my eyes at the moment. Yeah. Your vision isn't clear. You're not seeing things as they really are. You're thinking one thing and it's not really true. Facts don't matter. And truth doesn't matter. It's all beclouded. Confucius refers to this sort of person as small and petty and seeks only self-interest and immediate gains. This is the opposite of the Junzi. The petty person is egotistical and does not consider the consequences of his action in the overall scheme of things. His entire world is, or her entire world. Every decision is made in terms of this rather than this. Examples range from those who continually indulge in pleasure to career politicians who are interested merely in power and fame. Confucius experienced this type of person. This is the type of person that comes to the fore in times of breakdown and chaos. Neither sincerely aims for the long-term benefit of society. Following the fall of the Qin dynasty, as I mentioned earlier, Confucianism came in during the Han dynasty and was prominent for 4 centuries. So for 4 centuries, Confucianism was the main, I'd call it a religion, the main religion of Han China. You had Tao, you had other folk religion with it, but this was the main cultural religion of Han China. And it was the core of the various imperial systems, mainly the Han. When the Han disintegrated, this opened up a way for Taoism to become more important, Buddhism to become more important, and I'll be talking about those next time. There was a revival, though, of Confucianism in the 7th century under the Tang dynasty. Has anyone here been to Xi'an? The soldiers. Anyway, that's the Tang dynasty. So Confucianism was, and at that time it took on the name Neo-Confucianism. Whenever you see the word neo attached to something, it's a revival of something that went before. It's not quite old Confucianism, it's revived Confucianism. So it was referred to as Neo-Confucianism. And what was really significant about Neo-Confucianism, and especially during the Tang Dynasty, was its system of state examination. How you got to be in the hierarchy of the government. What we call a civil service exam. Civil service exams started in China under Neo-Confucianism. You don't just want your rulers to come from high families or wealthy families, or you want to make sure that they are educated. So they had to take exams, which they had to pass to be able to become officials. And when I say officials, they weren't just small bureaucrats. You had small bureaucrats right up to your ministers of state. And so this was a very important aspect about Neo-Confucianism. But over the centuries, and this does tend to happen with any system, Neo-Confucianism began to get a bit rigid. It was thought to always sort of look to the past. And as we enter the modern era, many modern Chinese thinkers, influenced by Western thought, influenced by Enlightenment thinking, began to look at Confucianism as a barrier that was holding China back. And that's why in 1905, there was the last official Confucianism, the republic that would emerge, got rid of Confucianism. That doesn't mean, however, that Confucianism went away. The spirit of Confucianism has continued to be a significant element of Chinese attitude towards the family and society in general, even today. And what we're finding, even under communist China now, especially with the changes since Mao's death, a reemergence of a lot of Confucianism. You find Confucianism now being officially taught again at higher levels, because I think the communist government sees the positive aspects of Confucianism for social cohesion. You get rid of a lot of the old stuff, but you keep that basic idea. Okay, before leaving, I want to just mention one more famous Confucian individual, perhaps after Confucius, the most famous. His name is Mencius. His dates were 372 to 289 BCE. So again, an ancient figure. He was born during the Warring States period of chaos, only 18 miles south of where Confucius was born, interestingly enough. According to legend, he traveled China for 40 years to offer advice, from Confucian point of view, for political reform. Rulers could reform their governments and establish stability, and he actually became an official in one of those states. Remember, I said it took 500 years for Confucianism to actually become a part of state government. Well, Mencius was one of the first of the disciples, if you will, who was going to these various kingdoms who were at war with each other and saying, here's the answer. It didn't really come for several centuries afterwards. While Confucius didn't explicitly focus on human nature, he thought people were basically good, but Mencius put a lot of emphasis on the goodness of the individual. He believed the individual is good, and that it was society's lack of positive cultivating influence that led to bad moral character. In other words, nurture. If a society doesn't nurture what nature has, then you won't get good moral influence. The good is a seed, and you find this in Buddhism as well. It's a seed, but what do you have to do with seeds? You got to water them. You got to give sunshine to it. If you don't, the seed doesn't go away, but it doesn't bloom. So he placed great emphasis on this. Thus he would claim, he who exerts his mind to the utmost nature and the way of learning is none other than finding the lost mind. Socrates was very much like this too. He said, knowledge is within. you have to find it. Finding it usually involves a good teacher at some level, someone who can help you find it. And this is again the value of education. You need those in culture who will help those youngsters find the good seed. If you don't, it will disappear. To show innate goodness, Mencius used the example of a child falling down a well. Walking down the street, you see a child falling into a well. Witnesses of this event immediately feel alarm and distress. Not to gain friendship with the child's parents, nor to seek the praise of their neighbors and friends, nor because they dislike the reputation of a lack of personal humility. If they did not rescue the child. So what is he saying there? People act to save the child, not for ulterior motives. There's something within that causes one to do this. The feeling, now, because we often don't like shame and guilt. The feeling of shame and dislike is the beginning of righteousness. If you have no sense of shame, you will never be righteous. Now, that doesn't mean you should walk around feeling constantly guilty, or there's such a thing as healthy guilt and neurotic guilt, okay? But if you don't have a sense of shame, then you won't draw on the good. So you have to be taught what is shameful. What is shameful when you're in line in the supermarket? Do you cut in front of someone? That's shameful. If you don't know that, you got to know that. You got to know these things. The feeling of deference and compliance is the beginning of propriety. And the feeling of right or wrong is the beginning of wisdom. Men have their four beginnings, just as they have their four limbs. Having these four beginnings, but saying that they cannot develop them, is to destroy them. Okay? The potential's there, but if you don't develop it, you will destroy it. Thus, human nature is an innate tendency towards goodness, which is in direct opposition to the idea of original sin, in which we are told we are innately bad because of some primal event. Confucius says no, and Mencius follows. We are innately good. And we need to instruct to bring out that goodness. This is why merely external controls always fail to improve society. A merely external control is always just about power, never about trying to bring out the innate goodness in a person. They fail. Why do laws fail if they are not internally accepted? If they're internally accepted, then they have a basis. Otherwise, they're alienating. How do a lot of people feel about the law? When you say the law, not good. The law is probably out to get you or control you. So if a system is only based on threat, on punishment, that's the law. That will fail. Because it drives away that sense of goodness in the child or in the individual in society. And pretty soon they will become that law. And we know that from following the history of abused children, for example. Abused children often become abusers. It's a cycle. And both Confucius, I think, Mencius understood this at some level. Maybe not at the level of our psychology, but they understood it almost intuitively. Improvement results from educational cultivation in favorable environments. That's why there is this move in public education not long ago. I don't know what's happened to it. I think it disappeared. creating the favorable environment for the child to grow in, not just rote memory books. Make the classroom an environment where the kid feels good. That's what, when I was teaching junior high school up in Vallejo, that's what I tried to do in teaching social studies. Whenever we were studying some element, I tried to turn that classroom somehow into that culture. When we were studying ancient China, everyone made a brick for the Great Wall of China, and we had it around our entire room. We said, in here is civilization, in here is culture. Go outside if you want to see barbarians. And they bought into that. Or when we were studying Egypt, having an embalmment and burying the pharaoh. Create an environment that makes it interesting and draw out that element is there. Confucius and Mencius both understood this. So a bad environment is just the opposite. You have a history classroom where the history teacher says, open the book and read the chapter, answer the questions. What kind of development are you going to get out of that child? Or they do it and they memorize it and they forget it. They really don't learn anything. There's I don't know if you remember this movie. It was called Teacher. I think it was a spoof years ago. There's this history teacher, and he runs his class this way. The kids read the book. They come up and get mimeograph sheets. They go back. They answer them. They come down. They put them in the box, and he sits up and reads the paper. Well, he dies, and the system just keeps going. And at the end of the day, the janitor comes in and pulls down the paper, and the guy's dead. Anyway, it's sort of a spoof. So individual effort is needed. You got to create the need and then the want. If you don't create the need and then the desire, you won't get it. Yeah. The object of education, therefore, is the cultivation of Ren, Yi, and Li. Maybe I'll send this to the state curriculum. Just take those three principles, base your curriculum on this, and you might get some good answers, good results. Education should also be that it awakens innate abilities of the mind and encourages investigation as opposed to memorization. One who believes, this is a good statement, one who believes all of a book would be better without books. That's the person who opens the book, tries to remember everything in it. Yeah. Take some of that information and start thinking about it. What's being said here? What are the implications? Yeah. Mencius believed that the proper path is one that is natural and unforced and open to the unforeseen. And we'll finish with this. The path must be maintained because unused pathways are covered with weeds. That's one of his famous sayings. Unused pathways are covered with weeds. Okay, that's Confucianism. Again, some might argue whether it's a religion or not. I believe it has all the basic characteristics of religion. Religion meaning to reunite, reconnect. Its emphasis is more on the social level and the governmental level than on the metaphysical level, but its impact is much the same. So, any questions, concerns, thoughts? Okay, next week we'll introduce Taoism, and then the following week Buddhism, and then we'll take a week off, and we'll finish up 2 weeks after that with the impact of Christianity in China. Okay, thanks for coming.